If you're looking for a complete, ready-to-go gaming PC that is small and sleek, but still packed with some pretty powerful hardware, chances are that you will come across this new Aorus Model S from Gigabyte. And the interesting thing about this machine is not that it looks like an Xbox, but that it has a very interesting internal design that is keeping this system very cool and very quiet under load. So without further ado, let's see how it performs and if it's worth getting it all. Let's begin. This video is brought to you by Seasonic and their Prime series power supplies. These top quality power supplies are very efficient, they're whisper quiet, extremely reliable, and my go-to choice for most of my test rigs and builds around here. And to make the deal even sweeter, Seasonic wraps it all up in a cozy 12-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below. The Model S is built around a very simple but very elegant looking case. It is all black with some openings for ventilation on the sides and on the top, and there is a couple of little details here and there to make it look a little bit more interesting. And I really like the simplicity and this less is more approach. On top of that, it has a very good finish and it is pretty sturdy, so it definitely comes across as a high quality PC. It will work well in a semi-professional setup as well as in a purely game-focused one, assuming you're not into RGB, because only this little Aorus logo lights up and it does that very mildly. It is about 40 centimeters tall and about 19 centimeters deep and wide, which puts the total volume at just over 14 liters. So it is pretty similar in size to the Corsair One pre-built PC or the NZXT H1 case if you prefer to build your own PC. Since it is a vertical case, it has a pretty small footprint, so it will be a great choice for smaller desks, but you don't want to put it on either side as that will block the airflow. On the front, there are two USB Type-A ports, a Type-C port, and a combined audio jack. And on the back, you get another 8 USB ports, including a Type-C one, 2.5 gigabit LAN, Wi-Fi 6, and a separate audio and microphone jacks. Further down, there are two display ports and two HDMI 2.1 ports, so this is a pretty good setup for an ITX system, and the only thing missing are an optical out and a Thunderbolt port, but most people can just live without those. This is made for a very specific target audience that just wants to buy a complete system and not bother with building or even opening their PC. But it is always good to know if there is an option to be able to upgrade it and how you can maintain it. So it only takes a couple of screws to remove most of the panels, which brings us to the very interesting internal design. Instead of going with the typical two-chamber approach with a separate cooling solution for both the GPU and the CPU, Gigabyte decided to spice things up a bit. So they put the GPU and the processor off to the sides and put this massive heatsink in the middle, which is used to cool both. They also added a couple of fans to pull the air from the outside, then push it through the case, and then all the way up and out throughout the top of the case. And I think that this is actually pretty smart from a cooling perspective because most PC workloads, whether it's production or gaming, doesn't really matter, typically only require the GPU or the CPU to work at full power. And doing it this way means that instead of splitting the cooling potential between these two components, either of them can use the full cooling potential of this massive heatsink in the middle, which is pretty cool in my opinion, and you will see later on in this video what this does to cooling and to the noise production. Unfortunately, there is a clear downside to this as well, because it makes this whole machine really tricky to disassemble, and with that, to upgrade as well. Now, you don't need to go further if you just want to clean out some dust, but you will need to remove the GPU from the heatsink and then remove the heatsink from the motherboard in order to access the two SSDs, the memory, and the CPU, which means that anyone who isn't super comfortable with working with PCs will not really be able to upgrade it or to replace parts, and even experienced builders might struggle with it a bit. That being said, Gigabyte was also very clear about this when we talked to them, and they said that officially this Aorus S is not meant to be opened by the user and will have to go through the same service as their laptops in case of repairs. So yes, I get that this was meant to be sold to people that don't want to open their PCs ever, but I still personally see it as a downside, because having an option to have something upgraded in the future is always better than not. But let's talk performance. This latest Aorus Model S comes with an i7-12700K and an RTX 3070, which should guarantee some pretty good gaming. On 1440p, which really is the sweet spot for a rig like this one, we got pretty good results overall. Most games will show anywhere between 90 to 150 FPS, and the most visually demanding games might not hit that natively, but that is where DLSS can make a big difference. Cyberpunk 2077 and Dying Light 2, for example, are really hard to run, but with DLSS enabled, we managed to also hit 90 to 100 FPS on average. 1080p gaming obviously works well if you're still on a 1080p monitor, but if you're considering a high-end rig like this one, I do suggest that you consider a monitor upgrade as well. And if we look at the 4K resolution, we kind of see the limits of this 3070. Most games will hit 60 FPS or more, especially if they're older titles or if they include DLSS support. But for some of the heaviest games, you will need to drop quality settings a bit just to maintain that smooth 60 FPS. It is completely doable, and it still will look better than a console running these games, but if you're really serious about 4K gaming, I will still recommend going for an RTX 3080 or higher. More importantly, if I compared the 1440p results of the Aorus S to a test bench using an RTX 3070 Founders Edition instead, there's only a marginal difference in performance between the two, which makes sense, as the GPU in this PC will use around 220 watts, and that is exactly the amount the 3070 FE uses. So this GPU isn't underclocked or anything, and you can expect the same performance as from a regular desktop 3070. Now, larger factory overclocked cards might offer you a couple of percent more, but again, the difference won't be that big. Thermal performance during gaming is quite impressive, especially for a compact, small form factor PC like this one. In Cyberpunk 2077 on 1440p, a GPU was pulling about 219 watts on average, with a temperature of 69 degrees and a hotspot of 80 degrees. And I would say that is well within reasonable limits. Meanwhile, the CPU was at around 63 degrees while using 65 watts of power. Other sensors and an internal temperature probe all reported reasonable temperatures as well, and the noise was at 42 decibels at 50 centimeters distance. Now, 42 decibels is audible and you do hear it a little bit, but I would say it is not that bad at all. If you look at the CPU performance, it is pretty much the same story. There's enough cooling to run the i7-12700K at 170 watts consistently, which results in pretty much the same score as my 12700K had on a test bench with water cooling. The CPU does get hot, standing at around 88 degrees on average, but that is pretty typical for these high-end Alder Lake CPUs. Internal temperatures remain all fine, and again, the noise is surprisingly reasonable at 42 decibels at 50 centimeters distance. Now, I do miss some sort of software control of the fans, or to be honest, any kind of software at all. So when you start this PC for the very first time, you see that there is a very clean Windows installation, and you just get a small pop-up window that is suggesting that you should download the Gigabyte App Center. And I kind of expected it would offer some performance profiles or maybe BIOS updates, but instead, it is just an empty application. Now, going to recommended software recommends some other Gigabyte apps that don't really seem to apply to this particular model at all. So yeah, this whole part was not a great experience in my opinion. And even though the default performance profile is really well balanced, and my previous Gigabyte software experience was let's say often more frustrating than not, I still think it would have been nice to have some options. So the model I have here comes with an i7-12700K RTX 3070, 32 gigabytes of DDR5 memory, 2 times 2 terabyte SSDs, and a 750 watt power supply, which seems really well balanced and is sort of a base spec that I would normally be comfortable recommending to other people. The CPU and the GPU are solid options and they aren't over the top, and you get plenty of storage. Unfortunately, I haven't seen this particular model show up for sale just yet, which means that I cannot really tell you if the price is good or if it's worth buying or not. However, I did find some Aorus Model S with an 11th Gen i9 and an RTX 3080 for $2,000 ex-tax or 2,200 euros including taxes in the EU. And I was surprised because unlike with the Corsair One, which is usually very expensive, Gigabyte's pricing actually seems pretty reasonable. So you cannot buy all of the parts separately as they are specifically made for this Model S. But if you want to buy similar parts with the same spec, it will cost you just as much, if not more. And that is without the Windows license and without having someone build it for you. But that is the case for the 11th gen system, not this one. And I'm not really recommending that you should go and buy an 11th gen system right now, or an RTX 3000 series for that matter, with the new generation of graphics cards just being around the corner. But it is a very good sign that the prices can be reasonable if you go for a pre-built SFF PC, because objectively, it is a very good machine with a very decent concept behind it. It is compact, it looks elegant, it has good connections, and it performs really well, with upgradability being the only big downside in my opinion. So if you're in the market for a good ready-to-go pre-built gaming PC and you manage to spot one of these in the wild with well-balanced specs and a reasonable price, it will absolutely be worth considering. Now, that is all I have for today. Please let me know in the comments down below what do you think about this little machine, and if you would ever go for a pre-built one or you prefer pulling your sleeves up and building it yourself. And if you like this video, don't forget to click that subscribe button to never miss an upload. Bye guys, and see you in the next one.